The environmentalist movement of the 1960s was perhaps the most influential period of environmental legislative production ever. The evolution of wilderness during this era, an idea whose evolution grew to shape the movement it was a product of, defined the opinions of a generation. The environmentalist movement that would be forever changed, and the unprecedented events of the 1960s environmentalist movement will be cemented as a turning point in Western history. Wilderness in the 1960s initiated the 20th century environmentalist movement and sparked the greatest period of environmental legislative production ever. The importance of this movement was largely derived from the newfound ideas and perspectives on nature discussed during this era. These ideas radically changed the course of the environmentalist movement and provoked a widespread public outcry to save this aspect of our natural world. Environmentalists in the 1960s introduced the idea that nature has an intrinsic, unquantifiable value that must be preserved to prevent irreversible losses to the human psyche. They argued that its prevention is essential to our existence as a society, and we must act immediately to ensure its preservation. Through the discussion of this idea, a vicious critique of anthropocentrism and capitalism, through a newly developed idea of ecocentric philosophy, took the movement by storm. The spread of this ecocentric philosophy resulted in a reevaluation of the relationship between humanity and the environment. Environmentalists believed that humans could coexist in perfect harmony with nature, using the wilderness as an example of the final frontier within which this harmony still exists in our modern world. There were several key moments that defined the environmental movement in the 1960s. The publication of 3 texts, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Wallace Stegner's Wilderness Letter, and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, created the ideal social climate for mass legislative changes. These legislative changes included the passing of the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. This legislation took unparalleled inspiration from the critical texts published during the 1960s, as evidenced by the legislative wording directly lifted from these texts. Wallace Stegner's Wilderness Letter, in particular, had a profound impact on these pieces of legislation. Stegner's Wilderness Letter was essentially an argument for the wilderness. It pushed back against traditional definitions of wilderness by arguing that it has intrinsic value just by existing. It serves as a symbol of hope that nature will climb back from its rapid deterioration at the hands of humanity. Furthermore, nature holds its value regardless of its usage. Its existence alone, even in an untouched state, serves as a mental respite from the monotony of everyday life, promising that someday we may experience nature in its unabridged state. Stegner's literary style was visceral and emotional, thus increasing his piece's public appeal and causing the text to circulate widely throughout the general public. Stegner used emotional reasoning to convey his evaluation of the destructiveness of Western anthropocentrism. Through this critique, Stegner also sows the initial seeds of climate pessimism, which are further promoted by literary pieces that followed in the wake of Wallace Stegner's publication of The Wilderness Letter. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring offered a similar reevaluation of Western anthropocentrism to that of Stegner, through the publication of a radical text viciously critiquing the pesticide industry while simultaneously calling out government collusion within the industry. This absolute bombshell of a publication, published within the perfect political climate for inspiring rapid political change, completely altered the face of the 1960s environmentalist movement. Throughout the text, Carson warned of the imminent consequences of pesticide usage and discussed the limitations of technological progression for negating these consequences. Carson also shed light on the collusion between the U.S. government and the pesticide industry, thus demonstrating that the government was not acting within the best interests of the environmentalist movement. This text was written to maximize readability in order to appeal to the general public. Upon publication, the text immediately generated widespread societal upheaval, as the text fueled the flames of a social climate that was in an unstable state in the wake of the Cold War. Tragically, Carson died only months after the book's publication. It was unveiled that she was working on a book while she was battling cancer, which ended up taking her life after she published her seminal work. This reality turned Carson into a martyr-like figure in the eyes of the general public, as she ended up losing her life as her work started taking off. This only skyrocketed the popularity of her ideas and turned her into a cult-like figure with an emboldened following across the nation. The Population Bomb was published towards the end of the 1960s and drew upon the ideas presented by Stegner and Carson. The title is quite the misnomer, as population is not the only primary focus of the text. Ehrlich wanted the name to be Population, Resources, and Environment, but publishers were not supportive of this decision, and instead they wanted to do something more incisive and appealing to the general public. The Population Bomb dedicates a significant portion of the text towards addressing the imminent threat that population growth will have in the wilderness. Ehrlich even goes as far as directly quoting Stegner in this text, which directly evidences the immense influence Stegner's ideas have on Ehrlich. Ehrlich leveraged radical political theory, which directly appealed to a political climate which had been shaken to its core by previous environmentalist politicians like Rachel Carson. This text was perfectly crafted by Ehrlich to take advantage of the social climate of the 1960s, and as a result, the text had an immense influence on the environmentalist movement's success within this era. Additionally, Ehrlich truly doubled down on the climate pessimism introduced by Carson and Stegner. On the first page of the text, Ehrlich states that nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. This incisive language also further helped Ehrlich appeal to the general public and force them to take action to prevent the dire consequences Ehrlich documents in his book. Additionally, Ehrlich also attacked anthropocentrism and argued that it was a key factor in the downfall of our climate. The three seminal texts of the 1960s environmentalist movement all had several commonalities, which became essential principles of the environmentalist movement as a whole and our society's view of the value of wilderness. Each text placed an explicit emphasis on the intrinsic, unquantifiable value of wilderness. They also argued that its loss would cause irreversible damages to the human psyche. They each also exploited a social climate ripe for radical change to convey newfound environmental principles. We can also clearly delineate a rise in climate pessimism within each of the texts. Through this pessimistic lens, each text also challenges traditional Western anthropocentrism through the presentation of an ecological critique of capitalism. The legislative results of the publication of these texts and subsequent public outcry were swift and immense. The concentration and severity of legislation passed during this era is unparalleled throughout the history of the environmentalist movement. Additionally, the legislation passed took clear inspiration from redefinitions and ideas of wilderness presented within these seminal texts. For example, within the Wilderness Act, we can see the influence of Stegner's Wilderness Letter within the emotional language used in the final legislation. All of the environmentalist efforts of the 1960s resulted in the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first celebration of Earth Day at the end of the decade, essentially capping off a decade of immense legislative and social progress in the environmentalist movement. The social effects of texts addressing wilderness in the 1960s revolved around a complete reevaluation of the relationship between humanity and the natural world. We witnessed a rapid rise of ecocentrism and a demonization of anthropocentrism. Additionally, the ecological critique of capitalism sowed deep seeds of doubt in the current political system within the social consciousness. The spread of these ideas sparked widespread environmental activism for the sake of wilderness prevention, which took shape through protests, grassroots lobbying, and individual action. We can draw a direct comparison between the environmentalist movement of the 1960s and the modern environmentalist movement. The modern social climate is much akin to that of the 1960s. COVID-19 and the recent heightened concentration and intensity of natural disasters has created an unstable social climate that could potentially be exploited to support the environmentalist movement in a similar way to that of the 1960s environmentalist movement. The ecological critique of capitalism, first presented in the 1960s, also continually gained traction into the 21st century, and is now deeply infused within the modern social consciousness, and is currently at the forefront of modern climate reform efforts. The rise of this critique also went hand in hand with the growing climate pessimism of modern day. We can also learn a considerable amount from the actions of the environmentalist movement associated with the wilderness in the 1960s. We learned about the power of ideas, and specifically here, the power of wilderness and its value and ability to spark nationwide action in the name of environmental defense. The value of specific social climates for inciting rapid change cannot be understated, as evidenced by its importance in inciting the widespread protests that occurred within the 1960s. Environmental and social issues are also closely intertwined, as we witness the clear divide between ecocentrism and anthropocentrism and how it influenced the environmentalist movement throughout history. Finally, we uncovered that large corporations, especially in capitalist nations, must be held under intense scrutiny for climate efforts to be successful.